Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Griffin from the Cooperative Development Foundation, and welcome to our webinar today, Shared Equity Housing, the Local Agency Perspective. We appreciate you joining us. Just a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about our agenda today. We can go to the next slide. We're going to introduce you to the Affordable Housing Initiative at Cooperative Development Foundation, and then we're going to give a general sort of high-level overview about shared equity housing and what we mean by that. And then we'll move into talking about city-specific examples with representatives from those cities to help folks understand what's going on in those cities and how they're doing their shared equity housing. And then we're going to have a moderated discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And we'll make sure to make time for Q&A. If you have questions you want to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat. And then we'll just send those to Margie, excuse me, Margie, who will be our moderating the session for her to ask. So I just want to give a high-level overview of our Affordable Housing Initiative. For folks who aren't familiar with Cooperative Development Foundation, we're an 80-year-old national nonprofit whose mission is to promote and educate about cooperatives across all sectors. And next slide, please. Last year, we launched an affordable housing initiative, basically to help promote the preservation and development of permanently affordable housing through shared equity models and help educate policymakers, communities, and residents about these models. And we're also demonstrating how shared equity can advance housing stability, racial equity, and other outcomes. And we're identifying policy, financial, and technical assistance needs to scale the model. We're joined as advisors with sort of the expert organizations in these areas, which is the National Association of Housing Co-ops, UHAB, which you can learn a little bit more about from Margie, ROC USA, those are resident-owned communities, manufactured home communities, and Grounded Solutions Networks, that is a network of supporting community land trusts. We have heard, one of the reasons we're doing this today is we have heard through all our work, we've been going across the country talking to different cities and towns about their housing needs and about shared equity. And we're hearing from a number of people in municipalities who work for local governments. There's great interest, but they're not aware of how the models work. They're new to the models. They don't know how the financing works. And so we thought we would have this webinar to basically hear from local officials about how they're doing it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margie Brown, who's Executive Director of UHAB, and she'll lead the discussion. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mary. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. Yes, I'm Margie Brown. I'm Executive Director at UHAB. UHAB creates affordable cooperative homeownership and has been doing so for about 50 years. We primarily do that through preservation efforts, giving renters the opportunity to become homeowners in the buildings where they already live. We are joined today by three panelists from cities across the country, starting with Stephen Erdman from the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. I will note that prior to coming to UHAB, I've been at UHAB for just about a year. Prior to coming here, I was also at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development for 22 years. It was exciting for me to see that today we have a lot of registrants with .gov addresses, both to be able to speak with these panelists that all come from that. And it's kind of a full circle moment for me to be able to talk about cooperative housing and in heavily government setting. So thank you. Our second panelist is Steph O'Connor from the city of Chicago. And our third is Erica Malone from the Seattle Office of Housing. Next slide, please. Oops. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Great. So I want to talk first just a little bit about shared equity housing. And there are so many models of shared equity housing that are happening today, which is really exciting. It's exciting to see new types of shared equity happening and new types of cooperative housing of different sorts. Today, we're really going to be focusing on shared equity homeownership. So community ownership of entities in properties, where residents have both a stake in the control of it as well as actual ownership. Next slide, please. And so why have shared equity housing with this element of both community control and community ownership, where residents have a stake in both those sides? First, it provides permanently affordable homeownership. We'll talk more about the both value and way of achieving permanently affordable affordable homeownership through shared equity housing. That's a mouthful. It's also an alternative to rental housing. It's homeownership that can be deeply affordable while provided like affordable rental housing can be, while providing that ownership stake. Like affordable housing models of all types, it's intended to provide prevent displacement, particularly in gentrifying markets and high market housing areas. It promotes the ownership and occupancy of housing, both supporting stability in areas, not only in the housing in neighborhoods, but in local workforce needs as well. And I want to emphasize that these are really long-standing models. UHAB has been creating this type of housing in New York City for over 50 years, and there's a really rich history of this in cities across the country, which has demonstrated that these models really provide housing stability over the long term and advance the social and financial stability of not only households and individuals, but of communities as well. Next slide, please. And so the key aspect when we talk about shared equity homeownership is really this dual benefit of benefits to the individual, while there are significant benefits to the community as well. We tend to think of most homeownership models as really mostly benefiting the individual. Community ownership and shared equity ownership really is meant to balance the benefits to the individual as well as to the community. And so affordability, of course, is key in this. Affordability makes that homeownership opportunities accessible to people with more modest needs. Typically, when we are talking about shared equity homeownership, we're looking to focus on low income and moderate income households. And that access and that affordability is preserved not only for that first buyer of the home, but over time to make sure that the community benefits from having affordable housing that is affordable to community members on an ongoing basis. What that creates then is stability. The opportunity for people to be able to remain in their neighborhoods. Both that initial homeowner of having a stable housing resource that is less subject to changes in market pricing and less risky in terms of overall costs rising over time, so that they are able to stay there. And then again, the stability of having other community members be able to access those homes on an ongoing basis. It is wealth creating. It is not only are the personal assets enlarged through this model, some of that comes through that being able to build modest equity in the home, but also just the cost savings that somebody has in their own tenure in the home equates to greater wealth and financial opportunity while they live there. This also translates into community assets. Having people live in the community who are able to build wealth while they're there, and to be able to stay in the neighborhood. Overall, stabilizes the neighborhood and increases the wealth there. Homeownership in general, and particularly community ownership, leads to more involvement in the community. There is data that community co-op owners vote more consistently than their rental counterparts, and even homeowners, individual homeowners. So civic engagement both benefits that individual and the community. And overall, all of this results in improvement both for that individual family, the community living in that building, and the surrounding community in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at 3 shared equity housing models. The first is limited equity or affordable cooperatives. The second is community land trusts. Community land trusts can house many things, businesses, open spaces, and parks. We're going to be particularly looking at community land trusts that also have affordable housing on them, and resident-owned communities. Next slide, please. And we just want to emphasize that deed-restricted housing and inclusionary zoning are mechanisms that make all of these shared equity models possible. Deed restriction and inclusionary zoning is used in a lot of models of affordable housing, not just shared equity homeownership, but they are kind of key mechanics in terms of how we make these 3 different models possible. So limited equity or affordable co-ops. And again, this is what UHAB does, and so really what we are closest to here. But this is affordable housing that is legally designated to provide housing to low or moderate income residents. So that legal designation can come in the form of, again, deed restriction or regulatory requirements, but requirements that obligate the residents to keep that those units affordable on an ongoing basis. Excuse me. Again, for this model, we're talking about ownership, collective ownership by the residents or shareholders. The shareholders commit to preserving that affordability by reselling their shares at a limited equity formula. What these limited equity formulas look like really vary across different types of co-ops. In general, they may be a restricted escalator per year, so equity can increase by 3 to 4% every year. In some areas or some housing types, it will be limited to 1% of market value. But one way or another, the regulatory restriction is there where residents commit to keeping that unit affordable. And another key aspect is that they are not just cooperatively owned, but cooperatively governed, that there's democratic governance among the residents that live there. Next slide. And so what does democratic governance and democratic control really mean? So there are various aspects of this, but they really break down into these different categories of physical maintenance, financial management, and governance. The physical and financial really is very similar to a single owner type housing model of whether it's a rental building or an individual home, that keeping up the physical and financial health of the property is so important. But here it is done through the control of the residents that live there rather than a single owner. So the governance and the collective participation is the defining and key aspect of the limited equity cooperatives. How each co-op goes about this really it can be 1,000 different ways. So in many cases, a co-op may contract a third-party property manager, but they are still the ones responsible for overseeing that property manager. They but in other cases, they may actually do the property management themselves. Similarly, with financial management, some co-ops are much more hands-on about this among their own residents, and some bring in a financial manager. But one way or another, the co-op residents remain in control of overseeing that manager or doing it themselves. And so in thinking about all of these ways that the residents are governing the household, governing the housing, the collective participation and the cooperation is just so important. So making sure that as new homeowners come in, that they are engaged in that community and in that the governance is a key aspect of affordable cooperatives. Next slide, please. So one thing that really impressed me when I started learning more about affordable co-ops was just how many there actually are. We get questions all the time about are affordable co-ops only in New York? Are they only in major metropolitan areas? And this map helps to show just how widespread affordable co-ops are. There are about 190,000 affordable cooperative units in the US and another 67,000 affordable cooperative homes in Canada. Next slide. Next, we want to talk about community land trusts. So community land trusts are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to develop and store land and properties on that land for the benefit of lower and moderate income communities. Again, these community land trusts can house all sorts of things and often house a number of things on them, including housing and commercial spaces and open spaces, and in some cases, farmland. Many of them contain different aspects of these just to create a really well-rounded community. Similar to affordable co-ops, the members of the nonprofit organization typically are the members of the community that benefit from this land trust. So again, leaning into the cooperative aspect of the model. Next slide, please. Overall, there are about 300 CLTs nationwide. And while there have been CLTs since the civil rights movement, there has been really exponential growth in CLTs over the past several years. There's a real movement toward community land trusts now, really to combat the problems that we have seen over time from individual ownership and speculation in areas. Communities are taking over the land to be able to make sure that it is operated in the benefit of the community for an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, we want to kind of talk about the nexus of community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives, because they are often used together to really have different ways of maintaining the affordability over time. Both of them, again, are about they're mission aligned, and they're both about providing housing affordability and on a permanent basis. They are both, again, predicated in community participation and governance, and both bring different aspects to the table of being able to benefit the community and to being able to steward community land and buildings on an ongoing basis. So they're often used together. And some of the models that we're going to talk about from the 3 cities today layer these like this. Next slide. The last model that we're going to talk about is resident-owned communities. And these are, again, a model to own and maintain land as affordable in perpetuity, so permanently affordable housing again. Again, it's just another way of restricting the resale and restricting the dissolution of the affordability and the corporation over the long term. Again, members agree to maintain the units as affordable on an ongoing basis. And the homes sit on land, and the homeowner has a proprietary lease for their individual structure, their individual home on that land. Next slide, please. So again, just as I have learned about some of this over the last year, I've just been so interested in how many of these already exist. There are 326 resident-owned communities, or ROCs, across the US, across 21 states. 75% of the home buyers on these make less than 80% of the area median income. As we talk to the three cities and in the moderated discussion, we're going to talk about the different affordability levels that that each of their programming hits. But I just want to call out that 80% of AMI and below is what is defined as low income, so that 75% of the home buyers in these ROCs are low income is just really impressive in terms of access to home ownership, which is typically thought of as for higher income people. And this stat too, that there is a zero foreclosure rate, just shows the stability and the reduced risk for the individual homeowner of affordable cooperative models. And so just a little primer on New York City affordable housing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. But again, New York City just has such a long history and rich typology of affordable cooperative housing. There are two primary types, and I think it's really interesting to kind of look at these together because they represent themselves two very different typologies of housing. The first is housing development fund corporations. These are smaller buildings relatively, typically averaging about 20 units in size. There are 25,000 units across the city that are in HDFC buildings, about 1,200 buildings overall. The vast majority of them are preservation. Again, this is the model that UHAB has really helped to develop over time, where rentals are turned into cooperative homeownership, helping the residents who live there become homeowners in the buildings where they already live. There's also been some new construction of these buildings over time, and Stephen will talk about that. There is a very exciting new construction program for HDFCs in the city again today. I just want to contrast this to Mitchell-Lama co-ops that are in the city. These are much larger apartment buildings, ranging from about 100 units to 15,000 units in size. The 15,000 unit one is called Co-op City, and it is really so large, it's like its own city. There are 69,000 co-op apartments across Mitchell-Lamas, across New York City. This was a very specific program built in a specific period in history from 1955 to 1981. But 63,000 of them have remained affordable today, and just remain such an important affordable homeownership resource for New York City. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk about more of New York City's affordable homeownership and shared equity housing today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Margie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm Stephen Erdman. I'm the Executive Director of Homeownership and Shared Equity at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And so HPD is the country's largest municipal housing agency. And so I just want to start by giving a sense of scale of what we're doing in terms of shared equity housing as a part of our larger work. So HPD finances on an annual basis about 25,000 units of housing that we're creating from the ground up, or that we are rehabbing and preserving existing affordable housing. And that's, typically in multi-family housing, those units are being produced. And so our shared equity work is a very small component of that overall unit production, but I think it's a really important piece of that work and something that we're hoping to grow and continue to grow over time. And so as Margie already shared, since the late 70s when HPD was established, the city helped create over 1,200 co-ops with over 25,000 units of housing across the city. And that's in addition to all of the Mitchell-Lama housing that was created prior to HPD's current existence as a city agency. So right now we have about another 100 co-ops in our development pipeline that'll total over 2,000 units. We plan to finance these through different programs that HPD has, and they will close on construction financing and go through rehabs or new construction over the next decade. And so, one of the really big barriers to doing more of this work is cost. These are HPD's most expensive projects on a per unit basis, and we're really limited in the resources that we have to create these units. We can't use the low income housing tax credit, for the most part, and so we're really financing this with a lot of New York City taxpayer dollars. And so that's one of the great challenges, especially as costs are increasing and interest rates are also quite high right now. We also are providing a lot of capital assistance and tax exemptions to the existing co-ops that are in New York City that need, new rehabs, capital work that they can't afford. They have expiring tax exemptions, so that's also a really big piece of our portfolio of work. And so some of these co-ops will also be on community land trusts, and we also have other non-cooperative housing that will be on community land trusts, including rental projects and 1 to 4 family homeownership projects. And so in total right now, we've already financed since 2020 or are planning to finance about 1,200 units of affordable housing on CLTs. And this is a growing component of the work that we're doing. We're partnering with about 10 CLTs right now. There's more that are organizing across the city. And we're also trying to provide a pretty high level of technical assistance to CLTs who, for the most part, are working on their first projects with the city of New York. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the really big question that I'm often asked is, what is the value of our shared equity models, and how are we actually achieving some of the goals that people will put forth when they're talking about the purpose of taking on the extra work, the extra costs of producing shared equity housing. So I really wanted to focus on some of the strategies that we use to achieve one of the big goals that we often hear, which is permanent affordability. And so what does forever mean? What does permanency to infinity really mean? It's kind of a vague concept. It's hard to wrap your mind around. And there's, of course, no way for us to actually guarantee permanent affordability forever. So the best we can do is try to increase the odds that our affordability restrictions and the use of property for public benefit lasts as long as possible. So HPD's strategy is to layer different strategies to achieve that goal, so that if one of those strategies fails, there's other backstop protections for that affordability. And so just starting here at the bottom, the kind of fundamental strategy that we use across almost all housing that HPD is producing is having it be owned by an entity called the Housing Development Fund Corporation, which is a nonprofit entity that is described in New York State statute. And so by definition of its corporate purpose, which is prescribed in statute, HDFCs need to use their property for the provision of affordable housing. And so that gives, a lot of control over what they can do in terms of selling their buildings, using their the units in those buildings to house different types of people. And so that creates kind of a baseline level of control for the city. The next piece here is, again, for almost all HPD projects, this is the 25,000 units a year, not just the shared equity work we're doing. HPD enters into regulatory agreements with the owners of those projects. So in exchange for the capital assistance that we provide, the tax exemptions, the low-income housing tax credits, whatever public resources we're providing a project, the owner of the project needs to enter into a regulatory agreement with us that prescribes affordability levels on the rent side, sales restrictions. On the homeownership side, it has income limits, there's owner occupancy requirements, there's reporting requirements. They're pretty robust agreements. They often have reverter provisions these days so that if a building wants to exit regulation, the city might have an option to take the property back under its control. And we tie our regulatory agreements often to the financing that we're providing. So if we're providing, let's say, a $10 million loan to a project on the capital side, we will have that loan come due when the regulatory agreement expires, plus, whatever 30, 40, 50, 60 years of interest that have accrued. And so the project will have the option of either paying that enormous balloon debt back to the city or signing on to additional affordability with us via a new regulatory agreement. So those are like our really standard approaches across all the housing that we're working on. And then for our CLT projects, we also have this ground lease mechanism where the CLT is owning the land beneath the project. They're leasing the land to the project via a 99-year ground lease, and the project owns the building, the improvements. And so here now we're empowering another entity that's not the City of New York, that's not HPD. We're empowering the CLT to also be able to enforce affordability restrictions. So now HPD can enforce restrictions via the regulatory agreement, the CLT can enforce restrictions via the ground lease, and the ground lease also requires the CLT to provide services to the project, financial services, counseling services, all different types of things that we would classify as stewardship. And so this is an enhanced kind of oversight that we see for certain types of projects we think is particularly valuable for limited equity co-ops who could benefit from some additional support that the CLT can provide, and that the city itself is not fully equipped to be able to do in kind of a delicate manner. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So just to put a finer point on that, I've kind of mapped out here the regulatory structure for a limited equity cooperative that would be on a CLT and have a regulatory agreement with HPD. And so we have three main parties here, as I mentioned: the City of New York acting through HPD. We have the CLT, which is a nonprofit that we would also have incorporated as an HDFC. And we have the HDFC co-op itself. And so first, HPD will have a regulatory agreement that is among all three parties. It will require the CLT to do certain things. It will require the co-op to do certain things. And we can enforce our regulatory agreement with either party via certain provisions in that agreement. So if affordability provisions are being violated, we can enforce via our regulatory agreement. And we also have our mortgage, our debt, that we can call due if there is a violation of our agreement to provide affordable housing anyway. And sometimes we assign a portion of that to the CLT as well. So we have an enforcement mechanism both with the CLT and the co-op. And then on top of that, the CLT has its grounds lease with the co-op. And so here, in many ways, if HPD sees that there's some sort of non-compliance happening with the co-op is selling units to people who earn well above the income limits for the project, for example, or they're putting units on Airbnb, for example, we could knock on the CLT's door and say, hey, we see there's some issues here. That means you're actually in violation of a regulatory agreement. You need to use the powers you have in your ground lease to kind of fix these problems with the co-op. And we hope that the CLT, as like a on-the-ground organization with like community ties and relationships, will be better equipped than we could be to come to an agreeable resolution with the co-op shareholders, many of whom may just not realize that they're violating these really important agreements. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So really quickly, we have two major financing programs that are creating limited equity co-ops today. The Affordable Neighborhood Cooperative Program is used to rehab city-owned buildings that are currently occupied by renters who are extremely low income and convert them into homeownership buildings. We offer units for sale to those existing residents for $250 or $2,500, depending on their income. So really, really, really low purchase prices. We also offer Section 8 to people who can't afford the monthly co-op maintenance, the monthly housing costs. So we're trying to make sure that all renters in the building are eligible and able to be homeowners, no matter what their income is. And then the vacant units we sell at prices that would be affordable to 80% of AMI households typically. We have some flexibility there on the exact AMI depending on the project. This program is our most expensive program that we have at HPD. We're currently providing about $500,000 per unit in capital financing to make these projects possible. And there's a lot of resident involvement. Then on the new construction side, we have the Open Door program. This is typically 60 to 110% of AMI. We're providing about $200,000 to $400,000 per unit in city capital. We also are mostly using this program on city-owned land. So we're conveying city-owned land for $1, which helps keep costs low. It's a much harder program to do on private sites where high acquisition costs in New York City of course, create many challenges with financing. And this program is really often combined with the CLT model, where we'll put 1 to 4 family homes or co-ops that are created through Open Door on a ground lease with the CLT. Okay, and then my last slide, just to wrap things up. I wanted to give everyone a little bit of an overview over a very special initiative that we are working through. This is a long-standing effort we've had to create some community-controlled housing in the Edgemere neighborhood in the Rockaway Peninsula in Queens. So starting in 2017, prior to 2017, culminating in 2017, HPD spearheaded a community engagement effort with residents of the neighborhood that were really hard hit by Hurricane Sandy. And there was a lot of flooding and disinvestment in the neighborhood prior to that. One of the recommendations was that a CLT be formed to own much of the city-owned land in the neighborhood and use it for public benefit. And so the city HPD released a request to the development community and nonprofit community in 2021 for proposals on how to set up the CLT. There was no such group organizing in the neighborhood at the time. And we got a lot of good proposals, and we selected one in 2022 that was led by some residents who've been really involved in the neighborhood for a long time. And they're currently working to establish the real Edgemere CLT. This is the Residents Acquiring Land CLT. And ultimately, we hope that they will partner with a developer who will be able to create 1 to 2 family homeownership opportunities on the yellow parcels here, and will also steward the green parcels as publicly accessible open space. The green parcels are most vulnerable to climate-induced flooding, and so we've peeled back new development from that vulnerable edge, but still want that land to be under community control and purposed in a way that makes sense for the residents of this neighborhood. There may be limited equity co-ops that are part of the housing development. It may be 1 to 2 family homes that are on the CLT. And we're seeing how this is all going to kind of unfold as we continue to work with the group that we selected. Okay, thanks very much. I look forward to hearing more from everybody else.
Hi, I guess it's me, Erica Malone here from the City of Seattle's Office of Housing. I'm the Homeownership Division Manager here. Thanks, Stephen and Margie and Mary. Thank you all for being here. I've been with the city for about 7 years. Quickly, just a spot about me, but to date, my 25-year career has been mostly exclusively with community land trusts, local level, regional level, national level. CLTs are my jam. So a little bit about the Office of Housing. Unlike some of your organizations, we don't own, operate, manage, or develop any of our own housing directly and rely on partners to do all of that work. The bulk of our staff is engaged in funding and policy work in support of permanent supportive housing and affordable rentals, but we have been increasing our work in the homeownership space, specifically shared equity, resale restricted, permanently affordable homeownership. And I say all of those things because I mean all of those things. And this is the space I occupy. So like many, maybe all of the cities that you are in, the gap has grown significantly between what low and moderate income folks can afford and the cost of a market rate home to buy. In Seattle, that gap is between $300,000 and $500,000. It's a chunk of change. So as we stewards, seek to fill that gap, and I think we should, with ever growing dollars, there's a real incentive to get a bigger bang for our buck. So hence the increased focus on lasting affordability. As I said, we partner with local nonprofits to deliver services, administer down payment assistance, foreclosure prevention loans, and the focus of this piece, the develop and steward permanently affordable home ownership. Next slide, please. We are really lucky in Seattle to have a long-standing community land trust, Homestead CLT, that started in the late 90s. They serve all of Seattle. They now serve King County, which is the county in which Seattle sits, and they are continuing to expand their service area. So unlike New York, having lots of maybe smaller geographic regions served by CLTs, we have one CLT that serves them all. We do have another new community land trust, Africatown CLT, who is more neighborhood focused, and they have yet to develop home ownership, but hope to do so soon. There have been other organizations that have grown into this space as well, can and do create and steward homes with lasting affordability, though usually I'll say using the tools created by community land trust, that 99-year renewable and heritable lease that Stephen was speaking about. Our local Habitat affiliate has successfully moved towards a resale restricted model, as have other more traditional CDCs. These partners are really critical in the success of ongoing affordability because unlike what Stephen described, we have a less robust compliance machine, but we do have a regulatory agreement, but we push much of the monitoring onto that stewardship organization to monitor compliance as well as support homeowner success. Co-ops are still a new and rare animal in the Northwest, but we have recently funded 2 limited equity co-op projects, and I'll mention those in a bit. So what does the city bring to the table? Next slide, please. I think the formula is quite simple. There's a lot we can do as public servants to facilitate and support the development of this type of affordable housing. Generally, I think they fall into these 3 categories. Next slide, please. First, obviously, money. Right? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention cold, hard cash. In Seattle, we are very lucky to have several local funding sources that support this type of development. If you don't have local resources, get some. Figure out how to create and advocate for the generation of such. Hot tip. Generous Seattle voters have recently voted to pass the largest housing levy in the city's history, a total of $970 million over the next seven years. 51 million of which is for home ownership. Sorry, are you guys getting background noise? These are my colleagues. Anyway, okay, sorry. And that's a huge increase from the last levy passed in 2016 for that was 9.5 million for home ownership specifically. We also have a few other less predictable funding sources, and I can get into that if there's time. One of the challenges we have that even with these resources, we can't fill the whole gap alone, right? $300,000 to $500,000 per home. We're funding sort of in the range of 150 per home. So we depend on other leveraged sources from the state, county, and other private resources, and that takes a lot to arrange. Next slide, please. This is just one of the limited equity co-ops projects that we funded with housing levy dollars. I should mention, probably like most of you, our homeownership resources are limited to serving households with incomes at or below 80% of AMI, area median income, which as of just recently, for Seattle, a household of 3 is $108,000. I was shocked to see that. Next slide, please. So second tool I think we have in our toolbox is the policies that we create around how we make investments. Work with your partners, see if there aren't obstacles you can remove. This is easier by far if you have a local funding source, or additional clarity you can create. Make choosing permanently affordable options the easier choice for your development partners. Anyone interested in our housing funding policies, I can share those, drop those in the link or send it out. Drop those in the chat or send them out after with the recorded webinar. We are always improving those, and one of the improvements we've made recently is made sure that limited equity co-ops are clearly in eligible use. Next slide, please. Some of the creative solutions that our partners have come up with is creative use of zoning. So this is a project that sort of walks like a duck from a permitting perspective, but quacks like a goose from a funding perspective. It's 2 single-family detached homes that is actually legally structured as a 10-dwelling co-op, which is really exciting. That's new for us. Next slide, please. Third and final element, I think, is the securing of and distribution of land. Making surplus publicly owned land available at no cost decreases the size of that gap that I spoke to, essentially becoming a part of that capital stack that makes the homes affordable. So over the past few years, we've been able to secure 13 new development sites for the development of permanently affordable homeownership. They'll include roughly 175 homes of the 500 homes projected to come online in the next 5 years at a very different scale than New York is operating at, but still huge for us. Next slide, please. One such partnership that was successful was with our regional transit authority, Sound Transit, where in 2021, we successfully negotiated a no-cost transfer of 10 sites along a light rail corridor in the Rainier Valley, one of Seattle's most diverse neighborhoods that had experienced a lot of displacement, in large part due to rapid transit investments. So this is really exciting. We're going to have about 150 new permanently affordable homes along this light rail corridor, transit-oriented development, working with local community-based organizations. Next slide, please. Whew, am I talking fast? We were a little bit maybe behind time. I'll take a breath. Okay, so just one example of a project that can result from making surplus city-owned land affordable, or excuse me, available at no cost, which is, yes, affordable. You can read the stats of the project on the slide, but wanted to highlight the spread between the affordable homes and the market rate homes, nearly $500,000. Now, Homestead is a classic community land trust with membership and the classic tripartite board that creates accountability that Margie was speaking to, accountability to both their homeowner leaseholders as well as the broader community. They're using the 99-year renewable inheritable ground lease here, which is a durable legal agreement, right, that requires owner occupancy. And if or when a homeowner goes to resell their home, they do so at an affordable price to the next eligible buyer, and so on and so on. These tools, though, can be used by other types of organizations like, next slide, please, our local habitat affiliate, another surplus land site that has created now 7 new townhomes. They use that same 99-year ground lease and provide ongoing stewardship and homeowner support. Whew. And now to Chicago.
Great, thank you all. My name is Steph O'Connor. I work in the Department of Housing here in the city of Chicago, specifically on the homeownership team. As you probably could have guessed, that's what we all do here. So the city of Chicago, I should say, in comparison to Seattle and New York, is possibly a bit newer to the way that we as a city are supporting some of these models. We are testing things out. We're trying things out with the help of folks that you have and a lot of other people supporting us as we figure out how institutionally as a city to do a better job in supporting the existing co-ops in our city, the existing land trusts, and the affordable housing that does exist in a lot of places, but has not been able to access city funding. So if you're curious about how to do it, we are in this journey now, figuring out some of these regulatory agreements. So like always happy to talk to people about the things that we're learning along the way and that we have learned not to do so far. So the approach we took was a bit different. It didn't necessarily start here just with the Department of Housing. As a city, our Office of Equity and Racial Justice started this community wealth building initiative all across the city. So more of a hub model, centering community wealth building and framing all of the things that exist under this umbrella as an approach to economic development, rooted with shared ownership, local democratic control of community assets. The next slide, I think I'll get more specific. So if we narrow that down to what we do here at Department of Housing, the 2 areas that we support are the limited equity housing co-ops and community land trusts. So this umbrella that the city took started with support in building this ecosystem in phase 1, and then second, to actually support organizations doing that. And now in this 3rd phase that we're sort of still in is actually supporting those doing the work. So this is where we are. It started kind of citywide, but now it's nearing to the departments doing the work. So housing taking on this support, this is in line with what we do, but really seeing how we can actually support folks in the community doing this. So the first few years of this, we're actually like building out the infrastructure that some other cities have when it comes to education, knowledge sharing, even like communicating with other city departments about what these models look like and how we as a city can support them. Turns out not a lot of that was institutionalized here in Chicago. I mean, there were pockets of it, but that's a lot of what we've been doing. So here under DOH's purview, we are building a program to support these 2 models. And I'll give a little snapshot in the next slide about kind of what does exist in Chicago and why we need to build this better here in the city. So there are 56 limited equity co-ops in Chicago. That's about 7,000 units. Obviously, compared to New York, it's tiny, but they've existed a long time, and some just sort of flew under the radar. They're in 26 out of our 75 community areas, so there's a pretty wide spread. And many of them have affordability restrictions, but a lot are still naturally occurring. So we as a city are trying to build in some of the structures that exist in other places to support them to maintain that affordability, because we know that without those guidelines, without those limits, we're worried that they're going to get lost. They're going to flip. There's something, they're going to get switched to market rate. We're just going to lose those units. That preservation is going to be gone. So one of the ways that we sort of piloted this back about a year and a half ago was supporting an acquisition of some new units through a co-op called Pico, a great example of kind of started from the ground up here. Maybe 10 years ago, they asked for city support twice in the past for their first two buildings. City could not make it happen. We did not have the structures in place. We did not have the ability to make the way we support this affordable units, which should be something in line with what we do. We just didn't have the structure. By then, we figured out how to do it, and we built in affordability restrictions to help them acquire their third building. And this is the type of work that we hope to continue, because it's just building along with our support as like the city has been funding these units. We are finding that the regulatory agreements that we know we need to have in place just are like not there. For example, our assessor's office doesn't recognize limited equity co-ops to give them the affordability reduction in their property taxes. And that's something that as we institutionalize this, we can work with them to make sure that that happens. So that's the sort of thing that it helps to have city support in other ways for kind of tangential benefits that like we know New York has, but some of our folks here in Chicago, it's just not something that's built into our ethos yet as a city, and we're hoping to change that. You want to go to the next slide? So the way that we in the city are hoping to do this, full disclosure, we're like in contract negotiations with these folks like now. So you'll see more details about the program in like the next month or so. But we did a lot of listening sessions over the past year and a half with all these people in this ecosystem, and the resounding sound of the community is we need more money and we need it to be flexible, and we're willing to work with you, but we need it on both levels. We need it for buyers and we need it for acquisition of units. So we said, all right, we can work within those bounds. So our hope is to have two tracks in the program, one per purchase price for folks buying into that who with income restrictions, and then the second to acquire new units of permanently affordable housing. I can get more in the weeds on some of this because I know you guys might have questions, but this is sort of, we're still working on finalizing this because we've seen that if we can have a little bit of flexibility in those, in how co-ops exist, because there's just so many ways that people do this, we're trying to find that right balance with co-ops here. Some of the things that we've learned along the way is that building the monitoring and compliance is really important on the front end, but it's also not something that if folks aren't familiar with it, it's part of like what needs to be built from the front end. So building that into our program with our legal team, kind of educating them about co-ops has been really critical, and huge thanks to UHAB, who has like provided a lot of that documentation, and folks like in New York and all these other places to say, this is how we're doing it. It's not crazy. We've done this before. I think that does help with some of the institutionalizing of things that seem very new, but are not obviously new in the world of co-ops. I think that's all I have from the Chicago side, but let me know during questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph, and also Stephen and Erica. Those were just really great examples, and it's so interesting to see the similar themes among them, but the different nuances in how each of your agencies is implementing this in your cities. So I want to get into a few questions. I will say we will absolutely still maintain time for Q&A from our audience, which I've seen some of the questions coming in and they look really interesting. So we will definitely get to those as well. The first question I want to address, because I know we get it so often, and I'm sure that the three of you do as well, but is with regard to the idea of limited equity. I think that this is probably the most controversial concept in shared equity and permanent affordability. The idea that in market rate homeownership, we think of it as wealth building. We think of it as a retirement savings, perhaps over time. And so people will say to us, "Why limit the equity?" So can we talk about the trade-offs between programs that are just enabling access to homeownership, but there's not ongoing restrictions on that, versus the value of limited equity and permanent affordability over time? Erica, I'm going to start with you on this, please.
Sure. Thanks, Margie. I think, well, I would start by saying we aren't limiting people's equity just for the sake of limiting equity, right? It's about creating affordability, security, stability, autonomy, legacy for today's home buyers, and ensuring that future home buyers have that too. And I think you mentioned it sort of in your intro, right? It's about balancing those two needs for today's home buyers and to future home buyers, but also for the community more broadly. So I think about it maybe more as, well, a better comparison might be, instead of market rate home ownership compared to limited equity or resale restricted home ownership, to be my option when I became a community land trust homeowner many years ago was I was renting. And so that's a pile of rent receipts, period, usually with increasing rents. And I'm moving every 6 months. And that's a lot of beer that I've got to buy my friends to help me move, you know? And obviously more substantive costs as well. But yeah, I would also say that resale restricted, permanently affordable, shared equity homeownership is the risk is lowered as well, right? And during the foreclosure crisis in 8, 9, 10, community land trust homeowners had a foreclosure rate of significantly lower than even just prime mortgage borrowers. So the upside is not as great, sure, but neither is the downside. And there's lots of other ways to build wealth and equity once your housing costs are stabilized, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephen and Steph, would you like to weigh in on that question as well?
I'm happy to jump in. I think here in the homeownership team, we hear that a lot. I understand it. It's a little bit of a yes and. This is a tool in our toolbox. We don't want to limit any form of someone taking advantage of a market rate purchase, but this may not be, that's typically not the folks we have coming into that. So I think the people raising that question usually don't quite fully understand who's taking advantage of co-op housing, and that people are genuinely excited about that. You don't just buy into a co-op having no idea what you're getting into. And so like explaining all the other benefits that come with that and why people want it has been a helpful tool to sort of saying, we're not limiting who wants to do this, but we know people want to take advantage of it. And without supporting it, we are inherently like not giving our community some of the options that are a really favorable choice for them.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add is just we often emphasize the immense amount of public resources that go into creating these opportunities. You know, in our case, $500,000 per unit is like a pretty standard figure at this point, plus a tax exemption. And so, you know, the opportunity wouldn't exist without that public investment. It wouldn't be possible for the person to be a homeowner in many cases without that public investment. And so that's part of the justification for limiting the equity to create that benefit for the next home buyer for the future generation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for that. You know, one thing that I would just add to that as well is that, you know, market rate homeownership and even so many homeownership programs that are meant to be affordable really entail very steep costs for homeowners. The percent of income that is expected to go to housing costs overall is incredibly burdensome. And so the benefit that someone might realize in increased equity over time is so often felt as somebody is in the home, and it almost creates an incentive to sell. whereas cooperative ownership and really affordable costs in that not only helps people to stay in their homes and stay in them comfortably, but gives them more bandwidth for money just to live. And particularly where these developments are meant to serve low and moderate income people, for people to have that money to live on, to be able to afford education for their kids, etc., is just such an important benefit of these programs. One other question that I will pose is, shared equity and cooperative models are often criticized, or people are afraid of them because they are seen as messy. They are democratic governance. Democracy is messy. Where in contrast to a single owner model, whether that is landlord controlled housing or a single family home, where there's just one owner to deal with. Somebody needs a loan. It is one person to really interact with that bank, or to there's not a vote that's needed to be able to take that out. And so what is your response when I assume that you all hear the same thing quite a bit. What is your response when people say single owner models are just easier? Let's see. Stephen, can I start with you on the response to this one? It looks like you might be having trouble getting off mute. So Erica or Steph, if you want to jump.
I'll come off mute if I can. Can you hear
Yes,
me? Yes,
we can hear you.
okay. I was hoping to get Stephen's answer first, but I mean, sort of a tongue-in-cheek response is, if it's not hard, it's not worth doing. Sometimes that's the right thing. I would say relationships are complicated, and there's got to be, I mean, maybe to Steph's answer to the last question, it's a yes and, right? We need all the tools to help. And relationships, yeah, this is a terrible answer. I think it's super creative and fun, and our system is not working for most people. Our housing system is not working for most people, and so we've got to get creative. And I think the creative is fun, and sometimes it's messy. Oh, good, Stephen's off mute.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, for stepping in there. So everyone, I don't know why I couldn't unmute myself, but I think, these projects are in many ways our toughest projects. They are our most expensive projects. And so what I always emphasize is that all of us who are involved with them have to be really, really good at articulating what we are accomplishing with these projects. And, I often think in really crude terms when we're thinking about HPD dollars being spent on producing affordable housing or on housing outcomes. A dollar spent on a rental unit is, increasing the housing supply. It's providing affordable below market housing, right? A dollar spent on down payment assistance is like promoting a wealth building opportunity to somebody who wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve that. And then a dollar spent on producing a new homeownership unit that is limited equity is doing all of that. It's increasing the housing supply or improving the housing supply. It's creating long-term or permanently affordable housing, and it's creating a wealth building opportunity. So that dollar is going much farther in that instance, or even though it's probably $2 or $3 instead of $1 that we need to spend on it. And then I think there's the really intangible benefits that we also have to articulate. And it's sometimes what's coming directly out of the messiness of a project. We're bringing more stakeholders into the fold. We're increasing knowledge about affordable housing production and housing issues among residents of a community, people who live in particular buildings, advocacy organizations. We're casting a wider net. We're bringing more people under the umbrella so that there's more awareness and supports to draw upon to create success in housing outcomes. And that can be painful at times, but I think it's all moving then in a direction where we have more people who are equipped to push these really good outcomes forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent.
I don't think I
Steph,
have
would you
much to
like
add. No, those were great answers. I mean, yes, they're sometimes messier, but that's like community is messy and the benefits of community pan out because of that, I think, because you do know everybody who you live by and you've all contributed, you all have responsibility for this. Like there are, again, I don't think anyone like usually living in a co-op is being forced to live there. And that's really important to remember that this is like housing choice is what we're increasing to.
Absolutely. I want to just home in for a second on costs. Stephen, you have especially mentioned, and Steph and Erica, you a little bit as well, about the costs of this. In the New York City landscape, I know that part of what is so expensive is that there is a real focus on preservation, and some of the buildings that we're preserving through that are the most dilapidated buildings in the city and also heavily occupied. So the rehab costs are so much. The relocation costs often for while the building is being preserved are so heavy. And we mentioned before that low-income housing tax credits, which are just such a the go-to financing structure for affordable housing, currently are not available for limited equity homeownership. Um, and so just focusing in on the cost for a second. Number one, you can answer this question in a couple of ways. Number one, what do you see that can be done to help reduce costs to make these models just more doable at scale? And I guess the second kind of question on that is, if you could have like your dream financing mechanism for these, what would it be? Would it be the tax credit? Would it be something else? Just bright ideas to make financing shared equity housing more doable. And anybody can jump in on this. I'm sorry, this was a impromptu question, but I think a really important one given the fact that costs have come up so much here.
Since I have been talking so much about costs, I probably should have an opinion on this. But so just I think quickly, I don't think there's like silver bullets for reducing costs. I think, there's so much you hear about out in the like housing think tank world about innovation in building technology and typologies and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think any of that is actually going to like yield the savings that people hope it might and like solve the problem. We really just need more investment at all levels of government to create the outcomes that are really needed. But I will say that I think having community groups that are focused on community controlled housing, partnering with experienced developers is a way to bring costs down, because unfortunately time really is money, and the longer a project's pre-development timeline takes, the more costly it is. The longer a construction timeline for a project, the more costly it is. Delays are extremely expensive. And so if groups who are seeking to create these really amazing outcomes are partnering with like people who are really efficient and experts, like that can be a recipe for making a project actually come to fruition. In terms of like what would be amazing in terms of resource, it would not be the low income housing tax credit to just have that be applied to homeownership, although I would take that certainly. I think it would be a really robust investment by the federal government, who, we just have not seen that kind of investment in terms of like subsidy dollars. We have home, we have CDBG, but these resources are just extremely, extremely limited. And, the city of New York, we invest, so much money into housing, and we can't pay for everything legally. And so, we rely on some state funds, and having, a pot of federal funds to draw upon would be absolutely incredible and really enable us to do things we're not able to do right now.
Yeah, agreed. Amazing.
I just want to lift up something that Stephen said in his last answer, actually, and I think that's why permanently affordable, resale restricted, shared equity home ownership is so important, is that there is no magic to making the homes affordable. It's blood, sweat, tears, and a whole lot of money. The magic is in keeping it affordable. Once we've done that heavy lift, let's preserve it. And that's what gets me excited about all of these models, and because it is so expensive and there is such a long-term benefit to be gained.
The only thing I'll add is that the city of Chicago is trying to use more local bond proceeds as one of the strategies for increasing financial opportunity for this type of work. It is specific and there are a lot of limitations, and we're still kind of negotiating with the IRS, like what is or isn't capitalizable when it comes to things. Obviously, certain costs are capital, and this is like a good argument for what it should be used for, but that's controversial politically, so, and has ramifications. Like every city doesn't have the ability to do that, but if you do, this is one option that Chicago is hoping to use. There's a common council meeting tomorrow if you like really want to get in the weeds on bond proceeds for like $1.25 billion over the next 5 years, like half of which would be used for housing. A lot of could be supporting things like this. So that's, I'd say, the most new, or I get not new, but like the way that we are opting to fund some of this, because LIHTC is just not enough to make that gap work.
Thank you all. We're now going to move into the Q&A with the audience. I believe that Mary and Hanan are fielding questions. If you want to jump in and ask those or send them to me, we will take that part.
Yeah, Margie, we do have a few, so we'll go through them. We've been monitoring them in the chat, but first one is, are there any, and this might be best for Margie or Stephen, but are there any existing examples or models that continue to include rental options? Would be interested if you have any data on this, but my understanding is that mobility is still high and many people prefer not to be tied to ownership, or maybe there's something in between.
Do you want to go, Margie?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, we do see, forms of community-controlled housing that are rentals. In New York City, we have what are called mutual housing associations, where these are buildings that are owned by the residents. They have no equity, but they do have decision-making power over property management choices and general building operations. One of the downsides is that the residents have to put a lot of sweat equity into, managing the building and managing relationships with property managers, and they don't get, that equity in return. But it can be really meaningful to have that kind of power. We also see some rental housing on CLTs as well. I think from HPD's perspective in general, though, we feel like we're able to achieve permanent affordability, and we could achieve some forms of resident control or resident participation in decision making without necessarily relying on an MHA model or a CLT model. And so, that's something we're interested in exploring is, we have, rental housing, permanently affordable rental housing is HPD's bread and butter. And so trying to also achieve resident empowerment in those existing models is something we'd be interested in doing. And it may not be the kind of traditional CLT structure that we think is really valuable on the homeownership side.
Can I just
absolutely.
add? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just learned yesterday about MINTs, mixed income neighborhood trusts. And I'm going to drop Trust Neighborhoods link in the chat here. It's sort of a new on the scene, at least new to me, neighborhood controlled, resident controlled rental portfolio. It's very exciting. So.
Excellent. And just quickly, I kind of prefaced at the beginning that here we were just talking about ownership, but there really are just so many models of cooperative housing, across the spectrum of rental to limited equity ownership to moderate equity ownership. And so there are so many models to explore. One thing that I will say that is just really valuable about limited equity homeownership is that, limited equity also, we tend to talk about it in terms of like what you can achieve over time, but it also means that your initial equity investment is so much less. And so in speaking to mobility, you know, if you have an equity investment that truly is affordable from the beginning, it doesn't restrict your mobility in the way that an enormous investment in a fully market rate home does. You know, there's a stat that in lower cost areas around the country, it generally takes about 7 years to be able to achieve any sort of equity return after buying a home. You know, overcoming your initial costs and the difference in price between homeownership and rental. In major urban areas, it tends to be closer to 12 to 15 years to really see any major return on equity for you know, across the board. Certainly, you may get lucky and move into a transitional neighborhood that's really hot, but that 12 to 15 years is a very long time. So to think of limited equity where you can put in a much lesser investment, and if your life changes, if you need to move, that it is not kind of so punishing to have to take your equity out and sell. So it is just another benefit in thinking of how shared equity, affordable homeownership really benefits people, particularly of low and moderate income.
Margie, I'll ask one, and we do have a few questions. So, folks, because we're gonna have your emails up at the end. So if people have more specific questions for each of the panelists, they're welcome to reach out to them. But we had one about just, can you use new market tax credits for co-ops? And anyone who feels most comfortable answering that, maybe Stephen or Erica, about using that mechanism.
I don't actually have experience with new market tax credits in our projects. I'm not sure if there's structural barriers to us using that. So that would be something I would have to look into, but it's certainly an interesting idea.
Ditto.
Okay, great.
I will just chime in to say that that is not my area of expertise. However, I do understand that you can use new market and historic tax credits in shared equity projects. However, those do not tend to be as rich as low-income housing tax credits, and so it is something that can help to support, but as like we've been emphasizing here, just greater resources, particularly federal resources for this type of housing, are so necessary.
There's also another question about doing new construction. Is there, sort of speaking specifically about not the preserving side, but new buildings and some of the financing that you can do with new buildings? Erica, maybe you can take that for because you've just been engaged in that process, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've got not great answers. Olu, the 68 unit limited equity co-op that we have funded actually several years ago, has been working since 2018 to get their construction financing. And it's new. Co-ops here in the Northwest are still new and rare, and so it's taken a while to get local lenders comfortable with what the approach is. For CLT condos, it's much easier, and we are underway with 7 multifamily community land trust developed projects. Oh, and I should have mentioned, you know, the 99-year renewable and heritable ground lease is all well and good when there's ground-oriented units, but Grounded Solutions Network has an analogous deed restriction that sort of says all of the same things that the ground lease does when there's a unit in the air, not associated with dirt, ground. You know, it's really the stewardship of the CLT that makes the ongoing affordability and homeowner success work. So think I was a politician in that I did not answer the question directly. I answered another question.
Well, here's and thank you for that. Here's another question. Are the vast majority of your projects cash flowing positive? What operating subsidies are available if Section 8 vouchers are scarce? And maybe if somebody wants to touch upon Section 213 and some of that financing. I don't know who wants to take that. Maybe I'll put it out to Stephen.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, so I mentioned the Affordable Neighborhood Cooperative Program, which is our largest homeownership program. We do use a lot of Section 8 vouchers in that program because the goal is to convert these buildings with low-income renters into co-ops and have every renter, so long as they've complied with requirements, they've gone to training classes, they're paying rent on time, et cetera, that they should be eligible regardless of their income. But you do need a building to cash flow if it's going to operate as a co-op. You know, if you're just a resident-owned cooperative building, you don't have other resources on hand. You don't have other buildings or other assets to draw upon if your particular building isn't cash flowing properly. So it's super important that the monthly income of the building is enough to cover expenses. And Section 8 is the key for those low-income renters to become homeowners. But as you mentioned, Section 8 is really limited, so it does, put a cap on how much of this type of housing we're able to do. And so that I think that's part of why on the open door side, where we're just doing new units, we're for new purchasers, we are seeing higher AMIs because you need higher income people to be able to afford a maintenance that is a monthly maintenance that is sufficient to cover those costs, which are higher now than ever. Other than Section 8, we don't have any traditional operating subsidies except for an indirect subsidy, which is the property tax exemption that we provide all of our projects that have regulatory agreements with us. And property taxes are quite high in New York City, so this is a really helpful exemption to bring costs down for co-ops, and that helps achieve those affordability levels.
Hey, we have a few questions on the organizing side. So can you share more about how in each city represented you're involving the tenants? And are there partners who are doing governance training and support and general community organizing necessary to achieve a successful CLT and low-income housing tax credit combination, for example? Start with maybe Steph on that. Sorry. You're on mute, Steph.
You're on mute.
I should know by now. How many years have we been remote? Okay, so I think a lot of this work has been community led, to be honest, bringing it to the city. Obviously, the support we're giving is sort of dictated by some of the rules that we have, but the way that we're designing both the program and how we're doing some of that train the trainer type models is community led. So the city provided this like ecosystem building and then sort of stepped out of some of that work. So the hub, the affordable housing, limited equity, shared equity, they haven't totally landed on a name. The hub that is sort of bringing this work and keeping it alive is all run outside the city, largely by organizers, some folks at local universities, with invited city and county participation at various times to sort of like advise on that. It kind of runs counter occasionally to how city folks operate with like this top-down mentality, but we're trying to use that and leverage that for what like inherently these models do and take a back seat and sort of obviously there's certain things you can't avoid, the regulatory things that we need to have in place. But the leading of those policy things has been driven by community, which has been interesting for everyone to learn along with.
I'll just chime in quickly. You have our role really is organizing both tenants in rental buildings to some of it is just really around housing rights, and in some of those cases landlords end up coming into compliance and creating better housing conditions, and tenants want to remain renters in some cases. But our tenant organizing is predominantly around helping tenants take ownership of their housing where the housing has been neglected. So that organizing to get to the shared equity model is so important. But I also want to stress just the importance of ongoing organizing and ongoing support and technical assistance for co-ops on an ongoing basis. Always there is a new generation of shareholders coming in, and there are just so many technicalities, new laws, and things to learn over time. So one thing that I would just emphasize as cities are thinking of creating shared equity housing is to also think at the same time of what are the resources available within the community to support this on an ongoing basis and to support those resources in the community.
Great, thanks. And we also had a question about do these models support tiny homes and other sorts of construction models like containers, something like that? And related to that, someone asked about, do co-ops in these models accommodate townhomes, sort of every type of housing style? And I'll just throw that out to anyone who wants to jump in.
I can jump in. One of the things that I think is really interesting is just how many different types of housing are used, how many typologies of housing can be shared equity housing. And kind of the things that you hit on there, the tiny homes, the townhouses, all of those really do exist today even. In the spectrum of the tiny houses and the manufactured homes are often what we see in the rocks, in the resident-owned communities. The townhouses, depending on the size, we have many townhouses that became HDFCs, like we were talking about, limited equity co-ops in New York City, where there are just 3 to 4 units that those units are cooperatively owned. And the CLT is something that can make all of these types possible. The types of housing that you can have on a CLT and cooperatively governed really are pretty endless.
I once set out to try and do a Venn diagram of like the physical typology overlaid with the legal structure, overlaid with the ownership structure. A community land trust can hold the land under really anything for permanently affordable home ownership or any other community needs. It can be structured as a limited equity co-op on top, and that could be a multifamily building, or that could be tiny homes this way. Lots of different ways to mix and match.
Great. Well, I'm looking.
Possibilities are endless.
And I think that's a great way to end this. The possibilities with these models are endless. It depends on what your local situation is. And you've just heard from experts. And if you want to contact any of them, feel free. Liz, maybe if you could put on the contact, the last slide. There's everyone's contact information. Please feel free to reach out. We're a good funnel also if you want to reach out to us here. So we just want to say it's a wonderful thing that more and more people are interested in these models of housing across the states. And if you have any questions or need support, know that there's people there. And we're trying to spread the word. So please reach out to us. And good luck with moving forward with any of your shared equity projects that you might have in mind. And thank you very much for participating and listening today. And thank you, panelists, and Margie for moderating. It was a great discussion, sort of flew by, which is always a great sign. So thank you. And until the next time, we'll see you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.